The fluorescent lights above flickered like dying stars as the hospital security alarm pierced through the 3 a.m. silence. Staff members scattered down the sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing against polished floors that reflected nothing but chaos. "Code yellow, room 314. Code yellow, room 314. The announcement crackled through the intercom, but by then it was already too late to stop what was about to unfold. A massive German shepherd burst through the automatically sliding doors of the Veterans Medical Center, his powerful muscles rippling beneath a coat that bore scars from battles fought in places most people couldn't pronounce. His amber eyes burned with a desperation that made seasoned nurses step back against the walls, creating a path they didn't understand they were making. The dog's name was Ranger, though the brass nameplate on his collar was scratched beyond recognition, worn smooth by years of faithful service and sleepless nights. His paws, still caked with mud from the cemetery 2 miles away, left a trail of earth across the pristine hospital floor. Each print told a story of loyalty that transcended death itself. Behind him, security guards shouted commands that fell on deaf ears. This wasn't defiance, this was purpose. The kind of purpose that drives a heart to beat long after it should have stopped, that pushes lungs to breathe when the world offers nothing but suffocating grief. "Sir, you need to control your animal." But there was no "sir" to be found. The leash that should have been in human hands dragged behind Ranger like a broken promise, its frayed end telling a story that would soon shatter every heart in that building. Room 314 stood at the end of the hallway, its door partially cracked open, to reveal the soft glow of monitoring equipment. Inside, surrounded by the gentle hum of machines keeping time with a failing heart, lay Master Sergeant Jake Morrison. His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, assisted by tubes and wires that connected him to a world he was slowly leaving behind. Jake's weathered hands rested on top of white hospital sheets, and even in unconsciousness, his fingers twitched as if reaching for something or someone that wasn't there. His face, once hardened by combat and command, now looked peaceful in a way that worried the nurses. It was the kind of peace that comes before letting go. Ranger skidded to a halt outside room 314, his claws scraping against the linoleum as he fought for purchase. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he simply stared at the partially open door. His massive head tilted, ears perked forward, as if listening for something only he could hear. The security guards finally caught up, their radios crackling with confusion and protocol. "We need animal control," one of them whispered into his device, but his voice carried uncertainty. There was something about this dog, something that made experienced men hesitate to act. Then Ranger did something that would later be described by witnesses as impossible, miraculous, and absolutely heartbreaking. He sat. Not the disciplined sit of military training, but the broken posture of a soul in mourning. His head dropped low, almost touching the floor, and from somewhere deep in his chest came a sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a howl. It was the sound of a heart breaking in real time. Dr. Sarah Chen, the night shift physician, who had been monitoring Jake's condition, emerged from the nearby nurses' station with cautious steps. She had seen many things in her 15 years of treating veterans, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of this massive dog sitting vigil outside her patient's room like a guardian angel made of fur and muscle. "Has anyone identified the owner?" she asked quietly, though something in her gut already knew the answer. The lead security guard, a former Marine himself, shook his head slowly. His eyes held a recognition that spoke to experiences beyond civilian understanding. "Ma'am, we found this at the main entrance." He held up a worn military ID card, its edges soft from years of handling. "Captain Michael Torres, K9 handler, KIA 3 days ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Chen's breath caught in her throat as the pieces began forming a picture, too tragic for words. She looked from the ID card to the dog, then to room 314, where Jake Morrison fought his own battle against time and trauma. Ranger's amber eyes never left the partially open door. His tail, scarred from shrapnel and service, lay motionless against the cold floor. Every line of his body spoke of loss, of a purpose interrupted, of loyalty that death couldn't touch. Jesus. whispered one of the nurses who had gathered to witness the scene. He knows, doesn't he? But knowing what exactly would take hours to understand. What they were witnessing wasn't just a dog seeking his handler. It was the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the bonds that transcend human understanding. As if sensing their stares, Ranger slowly turned his massive head toward the gathered medical staff. His eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human, and something else, a determination that made seasoned professionals take a step back. Then, without warning, he rose to his feet and padded toward room 314's door. "Wait," Dr. Chen called out, but her voice was soft, instinctive rather than commanding. Something told her that stopping this moment would be wrong, even though every protocol in her training said otherwise. Ranger paused at the threshold, his massive frame filling the doorway. The machines inside continued their rhythmic beeping, marking time like a countdown to something none of them could prevent. And that's when Jake Morrison's eyes opened, not the gradual awakening of someone stirring from sleep, but the sharp, alert gaze of a soldier responding to a sound only he recognized. His head turned toward the door with movements that defied his medical condition, and when his eyes met Ranger's, something passed between them that made every witness hold their breath. "Ranger?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper, cracked from days of silence and medication. "How did you—" But Ranger was already moving, his powerful body flowing into the room with the grace of a creature who had finally found what he'd been searching for. He approached the bed with careful steps, as if Jake were made of glass and might shatter at any moment. The medical staff watched in stunned silence as the massive German shepherd lowered his head and gently, so gently, placed his muzzle on Jake's outstretched hand, and that's when Jake Morrison began to cry. The tears that rolled down Jake Morrison's weathered cheeks carried stories that most men take to their graves. Each drop held memories of sand-filled foxholes in Afghanistan, of nights when the only thing standing between his unit and death was a dog whose courage outweighed his size. But Ranger wasn't his dog, not originally. 3 years earlier, in the brutal heat of Kandahar province, Jake had been nothing more than another face in the crowd of soldiers who watched Captain Michael Torres work magic with his four-legged partner. Torres, barely 25 but already legendary among canine handlers, could read Ranger's body language like sheet music, conducting a symphony of detection and protection that had saved countless lives. Jake remembered the first time he'd seen them work together. It was during a routine patrol that turned deadly when Taliban fighters triggered an improvised explosive device 50 meters ahead of their convoy. While everyone else hit the dirt, Torres and Ranger moved like dancers in a choreographed routine older than war itself. "IED, 2 o'clock, Torres had called out, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Ranger's nose had found the secondary device before the smoke had even cleared from the first explosion. That day, Jake had watched a dog save his life. What he didn't know was how many times it would happen again. The bond between Torres and Ranger was the stuff of legend, the kind of partnership that develops when two souls share the same mission and the same understanding that death waits around every corner. They moved together, thought together, and when the bullets started flying, they protected each other with a devotion that put most human relationships to shame. Jake had been a communications specialist then, responsible for keeping the lines open between base camp and patrol units. His world was frequencies and static, coded messages that carried life and death information across hostile territory. But during the long desert nights, when sleep came in fragments and fear settled over the camp like a suffocating blanket, he found himself drawn to the quiet corner where Torres sat with Ranger. "Mind if I sit?" Jake had asked one night, after a particularly brutal firefight that left everyone's nerves raw and exposed. Torres had nodded, his young face already bearing lines that belonged on someone twice his age. Ranger, ever alert, had assessed Jake with those intelligent amber eyes before settling back into his relaxed position beside his handler. "He's beautiful," Jake had said, though the words seemed inadequate for describing a creature whose presence commanded such respect. "He's everything," Torres had replied, his hand automatically moving to scratch behind Ranger's ears. "Some guys collect medals, some collect kills. I collect moments like this, when we're all still breathing because of something he smelled or heard or just knew. That conversation had marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Jake, at 38, was old enough to be Torres's father, but in the democracy of combat, age meant nothing compared to character. And Torres, despite his youth, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared death in the face and emerged victorious. Over the months that followed, Jake found himself volunteering for every mission that included the K9 team. Officially, he was there to maintain communications. Unofficially, he was drawn to the partnership between man and dog like metal to a magnet. He learned Ranger's signals, the subtle change in posture that meant danger ahead, the specific whine that indicated explosives, and the way his ears would flatten against his head when sniper fire was imminent. Jake became fluent in a language he'd never thought to study, reading the dog's body like a roadmap to survival. But it was during the quiet moments that Jake truly understood the depth of their bond. He watched Torres tend to Ranger's paws after long patrols, checking each pad for cuts or embedded thorns with the tenderness of a parent caring for a sick child. He saw how Ranger would position himself between Torres and potential threats, even during meals or rest periods, as if his protective instincts never truly shut off. "He doesn't trust easily," Torres had explained one evening as Jake offered Ranger a piece of his MRE. "But when he does, it's forever." Jake had felt honored when Ranger finally accepted food from his hand, and even more so when the dog began seeking him out during downtime. It wasn't the same relationship Torres shared with his partner. Nothing could replicate that bond. But it was something real and meaningful in a place where both were rare commodities. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he was learning to connect with a dog at the same time. His marriage back home was falling apart. Jennifer's letters had grown shorter and more distant with each passing month, filled with complaints about his deployment and veiled threats about not waiting forever. By contrast, Ranger's loyalty was absolute and unconditional. "Sometimes I think he understands me better than my wife does," Jake had confessed to Torres during one of their late-night conversations. Torres had smiled sadly. "Dogs don't ask you to be anything other than what you are. People always want to fix us, change us, make us into something that fits their idea of normal." Those words would echo in Jake's mind months later when Jennifer's final letter arrived with divorce papers tucked between pages of accusations and demands. But by then, Jake had learned something about loyalty from watching Ranger, something about the kind of love that doesn't come with conditions or expiration dates. The day Torres died, Jake's world ended in ways he couldn't have predicted. It happened during what should have been a routine sweep of a suspected weapons cache. The intelligence had seemed solid, the risks minimal. Torres and Ranger had worked the area methodically, their usual precision evident in every movement. Jake had been monitoring radio traffic from the communications vehicle when Ranger's urgent barking cut through the static. He'd learned enough of the dog's language to know that bark, it was the sound of imminent danger, the warning that meant everyone needed to move now. "Torres, what's your status?" Jake had radioed, but the response that came back would haunt him forever. "Secondary device." Torres's voice had crackled through the radio, strained but controlled. "Ranger found it, but it's connected to everything. If we move wrong..." The explosion that followed shook the earth for miles around. When the dust settled and the rescue teams reached the site, they found Torres's body shielding Ranger from the worst of the blast. Even in death, the young handler had protected his partner with his own life. Ranger had survived with minor injuries, but the psychological damage was evident from the moment Jake first saw him after the incident. The dog's amber eyes held a hollow look that Jake recognized from his own mirror, the gaze of someone whose world had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. "He won't eat," the veterinarian had reported. "Won't respond to commands. It's like he's just waiting." Jake had known exactly what Ranger was waiting for. He was waiting for Torres to come back, for their mission to resume, and for life to return to the way it was before the world exploded around them. But Torres wasn't coming back, and life, for both Jake and Ranger, would never be the same. The decision to adopt Ranger hadn't been made lightly. Military working dogs who lose their handlers often face uncertain futures, and Jake couldn't bear the thought of this loyal creature spending his remaining years in a kennel, or worse, being euthanized due to emotional trauma. "I know I'm not." "Torres," Jake had whispered to Ranger during their first meeting at the veterinary facility, "I can't replace what you lost, but maybe we can figure out how to move forward together." Ranger's response had been subtle, a slight tilt of his head, a momentary meeting of eyes, but it was enough. They were both broken, both grieving, and both trying to navigate a world that suddenly made no sense. The months that followed were filled with challenges neither of them had anticipated. Ranger's training was specialized for combat situations, not civilian life. He startled at loud noises, searched obsessively for threats that didn't exist, and often stared at doorways as if expecting Torres to walk through them. Jake, meanwhile, struggled with his own demons. The transition from military to civilian life was difficult enough, without the added responsibility of caring for a traumatized animal. His small apartment felt cramped after years of open desert spaces, and the silence of American suburbs was somehow more unsettling than the constant danger of Afghanistan. But slowly, carefully, they began to heal each other. Jake learned to read Ranger's triggers and provide comfort during the worst episodes. Ranger, in turn, seemed to sense when Jake's own nightmares threatened to overwhelm him, providing a warm presence that grounded him to reality when memories tried to drag him back to the battlefield. They developed new routines, new signals, and new ways of communicating that honored their shared past while building toward an uncertain future. Long walks in nearby parks replaced desert patrols, quiet evenings watching television substituted for nights spent watching for enemy movement. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was life, messy, imperfect, and precious in its simplicity. The night Jake's heart first showed signs of failure, Ranger had known before any doctor or machine could detect it. The dog had pressed close to Jake's side, whining softly and refusing to leave his position by the couch. When Jake finally called, 911 prompted by chest pains he could no longer ignore, Ranger had tried to climb into the ambulance with him. "I'm sorry, sir," the paramedic had said. "No pets allowed." Jake's last clear memory before being sedated was the sight of Ranger watching. From their apartment window as the ambulance pulled away, his massive form silhouetted against the lamplight like a sentinel keeping vigil over an empty post. Now, 3 days later, in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying dreams, that vigil had finally ended. Ranger had found him. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room's blinds, casting geometric shadows across Jake's face as he struggled to process what he was seeing. Ranger sat perfectly still beside the bed, his massive frame taking up most of the available floor space, but it was his stillness that unnerved everyone who entered the room. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Chen murmured to the head nurse, her voice carrying the weight of protocols that had never anticipated a situation like this. "Hospital policy clearly states—" "With respect, doctor," interrupted Nurse Patricia Williams, a 60-year-old veteran of the medical field whose wisdom came from experience rather than textbooks. "Look at his vitals." Dr. Chen's eyes moved to the monitoring equipment, and her breath caught. Jake's heart rate, which had been erratic and declining for days, had stabilized into a strong, steady rhythm. His blood pressure readings showed improvement that medications had failed to achieve. Even his oxygen saturation levels were better than they'd been since his admission. "How is that possible?" Dr. Chen whispered, but Jake knew how it was possible. He'd seen it before in the desert, when soldiers on the brink of giving up would find renewed strength in the presence of their four-legged comrades. There was something about Ranger's unwavering presence that reminded Jake's failing heart why it needed to keep beating. "He's not supposed to be here," Jake said quietly, his voice still hoarse from days of medication and intubation. "Ranger, how did you get here, boy?" Ranger's ears perked at the sound of his name, but his gaze remained fixed on Jake's face, with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. The dog's amber eyes held something Jake couldn't quite identify, not just loyalty or affection, but something deeper, something that felt almost like urgency, as if Ranger was trying to tell him something important. Over the next several hours, the hospital's attempts to remove Ranger became increasingly half-hearted. Security guards would approach the room with stern expressions and official intentions, only to find themselves inexplicably reluctant to disturb the scene. There was something sacred about the bond between the man and the dog, something that transcended policy and procedure. Dr. Chen found herself making excuses to check on Jake more frequently than medically necessary. Each time she entered the room, she was struck by the subtle changes in her patient's condition. His color was better, his breathing easier, and his overall demeanor more alert and engaged than it had been since his admission. "It's like having a therapy dog," she explained to the hospital administrator, who had called to inquire about the animal situation in room 314. "His presence is clearly beneficial to the patient's recovery." But even as she spoke those words, Dr. Chen sensed there was more to the story than therapeutic benefit. Ranger's behavior was unlike any therapy animal she'd ever observed. He didn't seek attention or affection from the medical staff. He barely acknowledged their presence at all. His entire focus remained laser-sharp on Jake, as if he was waiting for something specific to happen. The first sign that something was wrong came during the evening shift change. Nurse Williams was updating Jake's chart when Ranger suddenly stiffened, his entire body going rigid with alert attention. His ears swiveled toward the hallway, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Not aggressive, but warning. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, immediately recognizing the behavior from their time together in Afghanistan. This was Ranger's danger signal, the same posture he'd adopted before detecting roadside bombs or hidden enemies, but they weren't in Afghanistan anymore. They were in a hospital in suburban Colorado, surrounded by medical equipment and healing environments. What could possibly trigger Ranger's combat instincts? The answer came in the form of footsteps approaching down the hallway, confident, measured footsteps that belonged to someone who moved with military precision. Ranger's growl intensified, and his lips pulled back slightly to reveal teeth that could tear through flesh and bone. "Easy, Ranger," Jake murmured, but his own heart rate began to climb as combat-trained instincts kicked in. If Ranger sensed danger, there was danger. That was a lesson learned through trial and error in places where mistakes cost lives. The footsteps stopped outside room 314. A man in an expensive suit appeared in the doorway, tall, well-groomed, with the kind of confidence that came from wielding power in boardrooms rather than battlefields. His smile was practiced and professional, but his eyes held a coldness that made Jake's skin crawl. "Master Sergeant Morrison," the man said, stepping into the room despite Ranger's increasingly aggressive posturing. "I'm David Castellanos, attorney for Blackwater Security Consulting. I believe we need to talk." Jake's blood ran cold. Blackwater, the private military contractor that had been involved in some of the most controversial operations in Afghanistan. He'd heard rumors, whispered stories about cover-ups and classified incidents that left good soldiers carrying secrets they could never share. "I think you have the wrong room," Jake said carefully, but Ranger's behavior suggested otherwise. The dog's entire body was coiled like a spring, ready to launch himself at the intruder if given the slightest provocation. Castellanos chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, Sergeant Morrison, there are some questions about the incident that killed Captain Torres, questions that certain people would prefer remained unanswered." The room seemed to shrink around them. Jake felt his chest tighten, but this time it wasn't his heart condition. It was the familiar squeeze of fear that came when classified information surfaced in places it didn't belong. "Torres died in an IED explosion," Jake said, his voice steady, despite the growing alarm in his chest. "That's in the official report." "Official reports can be incomplete," Castellanos replied, his smile never wavering. "Sometimes they omit details that might be embarrassing to certain parties. Details about weapons caches that weren't actually weapons caches. Details about operations that weren't actually authorized." Ranger's growl had escalated to a barely contained snarl, and Jake could see the muscles in the dog's haunches bunching for action. Whatever Castellanos represented, Ranger perceived it as a direct threat, not just to Jake, but to something larger. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake lied, but even as the words left his mouth, fragments of memory began surfacing. Conversations he'd overheard on secured radio channels, orders that didn't follow standard protocol. The way Torres had looked troubled in the days before his death, as if he'd discovered something that bothered him deeply. "Of course you don't," Castellanos said smoothly. "But here's the thing about military communications specialists, Sergeant. You hear everything. You process everything. And sometimes you remember things that could be problematic for people in high places." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Jake felt his training kick in, the same mental clarity that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. This man wasn't here to offer condolences or ask routine questions. He was here to ensure that certain secrets stayed buried with Torres. "Visiting hours are over," Nurse Williams announced from the doorway, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. She'd approached silently, drawn by Ranger's aggressive vocalizations, and now stood like a guardian angel in scrubs. Castellanos' smile faltered slightly. "I was just having a friendly conversation with Sergeant Morrison about his military service." "Well, your friendly conversation is interfering with my patient's recovery," Nurse Williams replied firmly. "He needs rest, not stress. You'll have to leave. You'll have to leave." For a moment, the room balanced on the edge of violence. Ranger remained coiled and ready. Jake's heart monitor began beeping more rapidly, and Castellanos' professional facade slipped just enough to reveal something predatory underneath. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the tension dissolved. "Of course," Castellanos said, his smile returning full force. "I wouldn't want to interfere with Sergeant Morrison's healing process. After all, we want him to get better. We want him to have a long, healthy, quiet life." The emphasis on quiet sent chills down Jake's spine. "I'll be in touch," Castellanos added, backing toward the door while keeping his eyes fixed on Jake. "There's so much more we need to discuss." As soon as the man's footsteps faded down the hallway, Ranger relaxed slightly, but his ears remained perked and alert. He padded over to the window and stared out at the parking lot, tracking something Jake couldn't see. What the hell was that about? Nurse Williams muttered, checking Jake's vitals with practiced efficiency. Jake wished he could answer her question, but the truth was buried in classified files and sworn oaths of secrecy. What he did know was that Torres had died for something, more than routine counterinsurgency operations, and somehow Ranger understood that truth better than anyone. "I need to make a phone call," Jake said quietly. But even as he spoke those words, Jake realized that he didn't know who to call. The military contacts he'd trusted were retired or dead. The government agencies that should protect whistleblowers were the same ones that employed contractors like Blackwater. And somewhere out there, powerful people were nervous about what a dying veteran and his loyal dog might remember about a night in Afghanistan when good men died for bad reasons. Ranger settled back beside the bed, but his posture remained alert. Those amber eyes that had once saved Jake's life in the desert were now watching for different kinds of dangers, the kind that wore expensive suits and spoke in euphemisms about quiet lives. As night fell over the hospital, Jake lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of Ranger's breathing and wondering if they had both survived Afghanistan, only to die in a place that was supposed to be safe. The truth about Torres was out there somewhere, buried in classified reports and protected by people who killed to keep their secrets. But Ranger had found him against impossible odds, had somehow made his way from a graveyard to a hospital room through instinct and determination that defied explanation. If Ranger could do the impossible once, maybe, just maybe, they could do it again, together. The next morning brought what seemed like salvation in the form of Colonel Patricia Hayes, a stern-faced woman in dress blues whose presence commanded immediate respect from every medical professional in the facility. She arrived with proper paperwork, official credentials, and explanations that seemed to resolve all the mysteries surrounding Ranger's appearance at the hospital. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Hayes said, settling into the visitor's chair with military precision. "I apologize for the confusion regarding Ranger's status. There was a miscommunication in the K-9 transition program." Jake studied her face, searching for deception, but finding only the familiar efficiency of career military leadership. Transition program? When Captain Torres was killed, Ranger should have been immediately reassigned to your care as his designated secondary handler, Colonel Hayes explained, consulting a manila folder thick with official documents. However, Due to administrative errors during your medical evacuation, those orders were delayed. Ranger has been staying at a temporary foster facility while we sorted out the paperwork. The explanation made sense. Too much sense, perhaps. Jake had learned to be suspicious of convenient answers, especially when they came with official seals and perfect timing. "How did he know where to find me?" Jake asked. Colonel Hayes smiled, the expression transforming her stern features into something almost maternal. Military working dogs bond with their secondary handlers during deployment. The connection you formed with Ranger in Afghanistan was stronger than anyone realized. When his primary handler died, you became his anchor point. She produced another document, this one bearing Jake's name and signature from 2 years ago. You signed the secondary handler agreement during your deployment. It's standard protocol for K-9 units, ensuring continuity of care if something happens. To the primary handler. Jake stared at the signature that was undeniably his, though he had no memory of signing such a document. The months before Torres's death had been filled with routine paperwork, and he'd signed dozens of forms without reading every detail. The foster family has been gradually increasing Ranger's exercise radius, Colonel Hayes continued. Yesterday, they took him to the Veterans Cemetery for what they thought would be therapeutic exposure. When he caught your scent trail leading to the hospital, he simply followed his training. Ranger, who had been lying quietly beside the bed, lifted his head at the mention of the cemetery. His ears perked forward, and Jake could have sworn he saw recognition in those amber eyes, not of Colonel Hayes but of the story she was telling. "So he's mine?" Jake asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Officially?" "Officially and permanently," Colonel Hayes confirmed, handing him a thick packet of documents. "Ranger is being retired from active service and assigned to you as a therapy animal. All medical expenses, food costs, and training support will be covered by the Veterans Administration." It was everything Jake could have hoped for, wrapped in official paperwork and delivered by someone with the authority to make it real. Beside him, Ranger had relaxed completely, his massive head resting on his paws as if all the tension of the past few days had finally been resolved. "There is one small matter," Colonel Hayes added, her tone remaining casual even as her eyes sharpened slightly. "Some private contractors have been asking questions about certain operations from your deployment, questions that could be harmful. To ongoing security initiatives." Jake's chest tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that second-guess decisions made by good officers in impossible situations," Colonel Hayes replied smoothly. "Captain Torres died a hero, Sergeant Morrison. Sometimes civilians who weren't there try to turn heroic sacrifices into conspiracies. It's unfortunate, but it happens." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a confidential tone. "I'm told someone from Blackwater Security visited you yesterday. That must have been distressing, especially given your medical condition." Jake nodded slowly, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I want you to know that you're under no obligation to speak with private contractors about classified operations," Colonel Hayes continued. "In fact, I would strongly advise against it. These people have their own agendas and they're not always aligned with the best interests of our service members." The warning felt genuine, delivered with the protective instincts of an officer looking out for her soldiers. But something nagged at Jake, a familiar sensation from his communications training that suggested information wasn't flowing in the direction it appeared to be moving. "What should I do if they contact me again?" Jake asked. Colonel Hayes handed him a business card with her direct contact information. "Call me immediately. I'll handle any further inquiries from private parties. Your job is to focus on recovery and bonding with Ranger. Let the military handle military business." After Colonel Hayes left, the hospital settled into a peaceful routine that felt almost normal. Ranger was officially registered as a therapy animal, complete with credentials that allowed him unrestricted access to Jake's room. The medical staff, now aware of the official arrangement, began incorporating Ranger into Jake's treatment plan. "His presence is remarkable for your cardiovascular stability," Dr. Chen observed during her afternoon rounds. "I've never seen anything like it. It's as if your body responds to his proximity at a cellular level." Jake knew exactly what she meant. With Ranger beside him, the crushing weight of loneliness that had been slowly killing him seemed to lift. His appetite returned, his Sleep improved, and for the first time in months he found himself thinking about the future instead of dwelling on the past. The days that followed were the most peaceful Jake had experienced since leaving Afghanistan. He and Ranger fell into comfortable routines, morning walks around the hospital grounds, afternoon therapy sessions where Ranger's presence made physical rehabilitation feel less like torture, and quiet evenings where they simply existed together in companionable silence. The nightmares that had plagued Jake for years began to fade, replaced by dreams of hiking trails and open spaces where he and Ranger could explore the world beyond hospital walls and military bases. He started making plans, real plans for their life together after his discharge. Even the medical staff had fallen under Ranger's spell. Nurse Williams brought him treats from the cafeteria. Dr. Chen allowed him to accompany Jake to therapy sessions in other parts of the hospital. The security guards who had once tried to remove him now stopped by to scratch behind his ears and share stories of their own military service. It was perfect. Too perfect. The first crack in this idyllic facade appeared on a Tuesday evening when Jake was reviewing his discharge paperwork. Hidden among the medical forms and insurance documents was a single page that didn't belong, a copy of an incident report from Afghanistan that he'd never seen before. The report detailed the weapons cache operation that had killed Torres, but the version Jake was reading contained information that differed significantly from his memories. According to this document, Torres had discovered evidence of weapons smuggling by U.S. contractors, American-made armaments being sold to insurgent forces for profit. Jake's hands trembled as he read Torres's own words, written in the precise military language that characterized all official communications. Secondary sweep revealed U.S. serial numbers on confiscated weapon systems. Recommend immediate investigation of supply chain security. Possible insider involvement suspected. The report was dated 2 days before Torres died. Jake looked up to find Ranger watching him with those impossibly intelligent amber eyes. The dog's posture had changed subtly, no longer relaxed and peaceful but alert and ready, as if he had been waiting for Jake to discover this information. "You knew, didn't you?" Jake whispered. "You knew there was more to his death than an IED explosion." Ranger's response was to pad over to the window and stare out at the parking lot, his body language screaming danger in a way that Jake had learned to read like gospel. Following Ranger's gaze, Jake spotted a familiar figure standing beside a black sedan in the visitor parking area. Even at a distance, David Castellanos was unmistakable. The same expensive suit, the same predatory confidence, the same sense of barely contained threat. But this time, he wasn't alone. Colonel Hayes stood beside the car, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with the Blackwater contractor. Even from the 3rd floor, Jake could see the tension in their body language, the way Hayes's military bearing seemed defensive rather than authoritative. The peaceful illusion shattered, like glass. Colonel Hayes hadn't come to protect him from Blackwater, she had come to deliver him to them. The convenient paperwork, the official explanations, the warnings about not talking to contractors, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to keep Jake compliant and quiet while they figured out how to handle the inconvenient truth about Torres's death. Jake's heart monitor began beeping rapidly as the full implications hit him. Torres had discovered evidence of weapons trafficking by American contractors. Torres had filed an official report about his findings. And 2 days later, Torres was dead in an explosion that destroyed all the physical evidence he'd uncovered. Now, Ranger Jake's world collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The peaceful sanctuary he'd believed was real crumbled around him like a house of cards in a hurricane, leaving him naked and vulnerable in a way that made Afghanistan seem like a playground. He watched through the window as Colonel Hayes and Castellanos concluded their conversation with a handshake that sealed his fate. When Hayes looked up toward his window, Jake instinctively stepped back, but not before catching a glimpse of something in her expression that made his blood turn to ice. Not regret, not even guilt, but calculation. Cold, professional calculation. Ranger sensed the shift immediately. The massive German shepherd moved between Jake and the window, his body coiled with tension that mirrored Jake's own racing pulse. Those amber eyes held knowledge that Jake was only now beginning to comprehend. Ranger had known all along that the safety was an illusion. "They're coming back," Jake whispered, though whether he was talking to Ranger or himself was unclear. Jesus Christ, they're both coming back. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound Jake had ever sustained. Hayes wore the same uniform he'd once worn with pride, carried the same values he'd sworn to uphold, bore the same responsibility to protect those under her command. But she was working with the enemy. Worse than working with them, she was delivering Jake into their hands like a lamb to slaughter. Jake's hands shook as he fumbled for his cell phone, muscle memory driving him to call for help, even though he no longer knew who could be trusted. His contact list read like a graveyard of connections to a world that had apparently betrayed him. Former unit commanders who might be compromised, VA officials who could be bought, fellow veterans who might not believe the truth, even if he could. Find a way to tell them. The incident report lay on his bed like toxic waste, its words burning into his retinas with each reading. Torres hadn't just stumbled onto evidence of weapons trafficking. He documented it, reported it through proper channels, and died for his integrity. Now Jake held the same evidence, and the same people who had killed Torres were moving to silence him. "I'm sorry, boy," Jake said to Ranger, his voice breaking with emotion he'd kept buried for too long. "I'm so fucking sorry. I should have protected him. I should have known." Ranger's response was to move closer, pressing his massive body against Jake's legs in a gesture of comfort that only made the pain worse. This loyal creature had already lost one handler to corporate greed and military corruption. Now he was about to lose another. The sound of footsteps in the hallway sent both man and dog into high alert. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose toward room 314. Jake recognized the measured cadence of military personnel, but there were others, softer steps that belonged to civilians trying to match military precision and failing. "Code Blue, room 314. Code Blue, room 314. The announcement over the hospital intercom made Jake's heart skip. There was no medical emergency in his room, which meant the code was either a mistake or a ruse. Given the circumstances, he was betting on ruse. Dr. Chen burst through the door first, her face flushed with concern and confusion. "Jake, what's happening? Your monitors are showing cardiac distress, but you seem—" She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed the papers scattered across his bed, her medical training automatically cataloging the signs of extreme psychological stress written across his features. "Doctor, we need to clear the room immediately," Colonel Hayes announced, appearing in the doorway with an authority that brooked no argument. "Sergeant Morrison is experiencing a psychological episode related to his PTSD. For everyone's safety—" "That's bullshit," Jake interrupted, his voice carrying across the room with startling clarity. "Dr. Chen, look at these documents. Look at what they're trying to cover up." But before Dr. Chen could approach the bed, two men in hospital security uniforms stepped into the room. Jake had never seen either of them before, and their movements carried the tactical precision of military contractors rather than civilian guards. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Hayes said, her voice taking on the soothing tone reserved for dealing with unstable individuals. "You're having a stress reaction. These documents are classified materials that you're not authorized to possess. We need to secure them and get you the help you need." Ranger's growl filled the room like rolling thunder. The dog had positioned himself between Jake and the newcomers, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could tear through Kevlar. Every line of his body screamed threat assessment and protective positioning. "Easy, Ranger," one of the fake security guards said, producing what looked like a tranquilizer gun from beneath his jacket. "Nobody wants to hurt the dog." That was the wrong thing to say. Jake's training kicked in with crystalline clarity. These weren't hospital personnel responding to a medical emergency. They were a tactical team executing a cleanup operation. The tranquilizer gun wasn't for subduing a dangerous animal. It was for eliminating a witness who might fight back. "Dr. Chen, get out of here," Jake commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Call the real police. Tell them—" The tranquilizer dart caught Jake in the shoulder before he could finish the sentence. The drug hit his system like liquid fire, immediately beginning to cloud his vision and slow his thoughts. But military conditioning doesn't disappear overnight, and Jake had survived too much to go down without a fight. "Ranger, guard!" he shouted, using the command Torres had taught him during those long desert nights. "Guard the papers." What happened next would be talked about in whispers throughout the hospital for years to come. Ranger exploded into motion with a speed and violence that transformed him from therapy animal to weapon of war in the space of a heartbeat. 80 pounds of muscle, teeth, and absolute loyalty, launched himself at the nearest fake guard, taking the man down with precision that spoke to years of combat training. The tranquilizer gun went flying, skittering across the hospital. Flores, its owner, struggled to protect his throat from jaws that could crush bone. The second guard reached for his own weapon, but Ranger was already moving, flowing between targets like liquid death. "Shoot the dog," Colonel Hayes screamed, her professional facade finally cracking to reveal the desperation underneath. "Shoot the fucking dog!" But Dr. Chen had not left the room as Jake had commanded. Instead, she had activated the emergency alarm system, filling the hospital with sirens that brought real security running from every direction. The fake guards found themselves caught between a protective German shepherd and genuine hospital personnel who had no idea what was happening, but recognized unauthorized weapons when they saw them. Jake watched the chaos unfold through vision. That was rapidly fading, the tranquilizer dragging him toward unconsciousness, despite his efforts to fight it. His last clear sight was of Ranger standing guard over the scattered documents, blood on his muzzle, but his stance unwavering. "Good boy," Jake whispered as darkness closed in. "Protect Torres. Protect the truth." When Jake regained consciousness, 6 hours later, the world had changed again. He was no longer in room 314, but in a secure ward with barred windows and guards outside his door. Real guards this time, wearing the uniforms of federal marshals rather than hospital security. An IV drip fed medications into his system that kept his thoughts clear but his body weak. "You're awake," said a voice from the corner of the room. Jake turned his head to see a woman in her 50s, dressed in the kind of unremarkable business attire that screamed federal agent. "I'm Deputy Director Sarah Martinez, FBI. We need to talk." "Where's Ranger?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse from the after effects of the tranquilizer. "Safe," Martinez replied, though her expression suggested the situation was more complicated than that single word implied. "Your dog is in protective custody, along with the documents he was guarding. Documents that corroborate intelligence we've been developing for the past 18 months. Jake's mind struggled to process this information. 18 months? Martinez moved closer to his bed, her expression grave. Captain Torres wasn't the only service member who discovered evidence of weapons trafficking. Over the past 2 years, 7 soldiers have died under suspicious circumstances after reporting irregularities in weapons shipments and supply chain security. The number hit Jake like a physical blow. 7 deaths, 7 families destroyed to protect a criminal enterprise that was literally arming America's enemies for profit. Torres tried to blow the whistle through proper channels, Martinez continued. He filed reports, requested investigations, followed every protocol in the book, and when those reports disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, he started making copies. She produced a tablet computer and showed Jake a photograph that made his breath catch. It was Torres sitting in what looked like an internet cafe, uploading files to some kind of secure server. 2 days before he died, Captain Torres uploaded everything he'd discovered to a secure FBI server, Martinez explained. Insurance policy, he called it, said if anything happened to him, at least the truth would survive. Jake stared at the photograph, seeing Torres in a new light. Not just as the young K-9 handler he'd admired, but as a whistleblower who had risked everything to expose corruption within the military-industrial complex. The documents Ranger was protecting, Jake said slowly, they were Torres's insurance policy. Copies of his copies, Martinez confirmed. Your friend was more paranoid than even we realized. He distributed evidence to multiple sources, including some materials he apparently entrusted to you without your knowledge. The pieces began falling into place. Torres's behavior in the weeks before his death, the way he'd started asking Jake about communications protocols and secure transmission methods, The documents that had somehow appeared among Jake's personal effects from Afghanistan. He used me as a courier, Jake realized. Son of a bitch used me as a dead drop. A very effective one, Martinez said with something approaching admiration. Blackwater Security has been hunting for those documents for 2 years. When they realized you might have them, they activated assets within the military to flush you out. Colonel Hayes. The convenient explanations. The official paperwork that seemed too good to be true. Hayes is one of theirs? Hayes is a patriot who got in over her head, Martinez replied. Blackwater convinced her that exposing the weapons trafficking would damage national security and put active operations at risk. They played on her genuine desire to protect service members. Jake felt something like sympathy for Hayes, even though her betrayal had nearly cost him his life. The military taught soldiers to trust the chain of command, to believe that superiors always had access to information that justified difficult decisions. Hayes had been manipulated by people who understood exactly which psychological buttons to push. What happens now? Jake asked. Martinez's expression grew grim. Now we build a case that will take down not just Blackwater Security, but their contacts within the Pentagon, the State Department, and 3 defense contracting firms. We're talking about prosecutions that will reach into the highest levels of government. She paused, studying Jake's face for his reaction to what she said next. But we need your testimony. You were Torres's closest confidant during the weeks before his death. You processed the communications that documented the weapons shipments. And most importantly, you're the only living witness who can connect Torres's murder to the evidence he gathered. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Testifying would mean reliving Afghanistan, exposing classified operations, and painting a target on his back that would never disappear. But it would also mean justice for Torres and the 6 other soldiers who had died for trying to do the right thing. What about Ranger? Jake asked. For the first time since entering the room, Martinez smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her severe features. Ranger is the hero of this entire operation, she said. If he hadn't protected those documents, if he hadn't found you when he did, the evidence would have disappeared forever. Torres's sacrifice would have been meaningless. She stood and moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Your dog loved Torres enough to spend 2 years mourning his death, Martinez said quietly. But he loves you enough to risk his life protecting Torres's legacy. That's not just loyalty, Sergeant Morrison. That's family. The rage came first, building in Jake's chest like a slow-burning fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of combat, but something colder and more focused, the kind of fury that could sustain itself through months of legal proceedings and media scrutiny. They had killed Torres, not just killed him, but murdered him to protect profits built on the blood of American soldiers. They had turned the uniform Jake had worn with pride into a costume for corporate assassins. They had perverted everything he'd believed about honor, duty, and the sacred trust between those who serve. But beneath the rage, stronger than the rage, was something else entirely. Love. Love for a young captain who had died trying to do the right thing. Love for 6 other soldiers whose names Jake didn't even know but whose sacrifices demanded recognition. Love for a country that deserved better than leaders who sold weapons to its enemies. And love for a German shepherd whose loyalty transcended death itself. Jake spent the first day after his conversation with Martinez lying in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and feeling emotions cycle through him like weather patterns. Rage would build until it threatened to tear him apart, then recede as waves of grief crashed over him, only to be replaced by a resolve so fierce it made his earlier anger seem pale by comparison. Deputy Director Martinez had left him with a choice: testify and help bring down a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, or disappear into witness protection and let Torres's sacrifice remain forever hidden. It should have been an easy decision. Jake had never backed down from a fight in his life, but this wasn't just about him anymore. Your testimony will make you a target, Martinez had warned during their second conversation. These people have killed 7 soldiers and a dozen civilians to protect their operation. They won't hesitate to eliminate you if they get the chance. Jake could accept that risk for himself. He'd been living with death as a possibility since the day he'd enlisted. But Ranger didn't deserve to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for threats that existed because of human greed and corruption. The internal struggle might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened on the third day. Jake was in the middle of a physical therapy session, working to rebuild the strength that days of medication and stress had stolen from his body when Ranger was finally brought to see him. The reunion took place in a secure conference room under the watchful eyes of federal marshals, but the security measures became irrelevant the moment Jake and Ranger locked eyes. The massive German shepherd crossed the room in 3 bounds, his entire body vibrating with joy and relief that his human was alive and whole. Jake dropped to one knee and wrapped his arms around 80 pounds of fur and muscle, feeling tears stream down his face as Ranger's familiar scent filled his nostrils. "I'm sorry, boy," Jake whispered into Ranger's ear. "I'm so fucking sorry. I let them hurt you." But as Jake held his 4-legged family, he noticed something that stopped his self-recrimination cold. Ranger bore fresh scars, recent cuts across his muzzle and shoulders that spoke of violent encounters. The dog had been hurt protecting Torres's evidence, had fought trained killers to keep the truth alive, and he had won. "Deputy Director Martinez told me what you did," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion and pride. "She said you saved the case, saved the evidence, saved Torres's legacy." Ranger's response was to press closer, his massive head resting against Jake's chest in a gesture of absolute trust. This dog had endured loss, betrayal, violence, and uncertainty, but his loyalty remained unshaken. He had risked everything to protect what Torres had died for, and he would do it again without hesitation. That's when Jake understood what he had to do. The decision wasn't about courage or patriotism or even justice, though all of those elements played a part. The decision was about love, specifically about proving himself worthy of the loyalty that Ranger had shown for 2 years. Torres had trusted Jake with evidence that could expose a criminal conspiracy. Ranger had protected that evidence with his life. Now it was Jake's turn to honor that chain of trust by seeing it through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. "We're going to testify," Jake said, looking directly into Ranger's amber eyes. "We're going to tell them what happened to Torres, and we're going to make sure everyone knows what kind of man he was." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, not the exuberant wagging of a happy dog, but the measured approval of a soldier acknowledging orders from a trusted commander. Over the following weeks, Jake threw himself into preparation for the trial with the same intensity he'd once brought to military operations. He studied every document, memorized every detail, and worked with federal prosecutors to build a case that would honor Torres's memory while exposing the full scope of the criminal conspiracy. The process was grueling, both physically and emotionally. Jake had to relive his deployment in excruciating detail, describing conversations and observations that painted a picture of systematic corruption within the military supply chain. He had to confront his own failures, the signs he'd missed, the warnings he'd ignored, the opportunities he'd had to prevent Torres's death. But Ranger was with him through every session, every interview, every sleepless night when memories threatened to overwhelm his resolve. The dog's presence provided an anchor to reality when the weight of testimony threatened to drag Jake into despair. "You understand what you're risking," Martinez reminded him during one of their preparation sessions. "Blackwater's clients include some of the most powerful people in Washington. They have resources, connections, and a history of eliminating threats to their operations." Jake's response was to reach down and scratch behind Ranger's ears, drawing strength from the contact. "Torres was 25 years old," Jake said quietly. "He had his whole life ahead of him, and they murdered him to protect their profit margins. If that doesn't deserve justice, then nothing does." Martinez nodded approvingly. "The grand jury convenes in 2 weeks. Are you ready?" Jake looked down at Ranger, seeing not just a therapy animal or even a loyal companion, but a partner in the truest sense of the word. They had both lost Torres, both suffered because of corporate greed and military corruption, both fought to protect the truth that Torres had died to expose. "We're ready," Jake said, speaking for both of them. The transformation was complete. The broken veteran who had been slowly dying of loneliness and despair was gone, replaced by a man with purpose that transcended personal pain. The traumatized dog who had spent 2 years mourning his handler was still grieving, but he was no longer alone in that grief. They were family now, bonded not just by shared loss, but by shared determination to ensure that Torres's sacrifice would not be forgotten. Jake spent his final night before testimony, sitting by the window of his secure hospital room, watching Ranger sleep peacefully for the first time since they'd been reunited. The dog's breathing was steady and relaxed, his massive body completely at rest, in a way that spoke of absolute trust in his human's ability to protect them both. Tomorrow would bring cameras, questions, and testimony that would expose a criminal conspiracy, reaching into the highest levels of government. There would be threats, intimidation attempts, and quite possibly violence from people desperate to keep their secrets buried. But tonight, in a quiet hospital room protected by federal marshals, a man and his dog prepared for battle with the calm confidence of soldiers who had found something worth fighting for: justice for Torres. Truth about the 7 dead soldiers, accountability for those who had perverted military service into personal profit, and most importantly, proof that loyalty, real loyalty, could survive anything that corrupt men might do to destroy it. Jake reached down and gently stroked Ranger's sleeping form, feeling the steady rise and fall of breathing that had become his own anchor to hope. "Tomorrow, boy," he whispered. "Tomorrow we make them pay." The federal courthouse in Denver had been transformed into a fortress. Metal detectors, armed marshals, and bomb-sniffing dogs created layers of security that spoke to the explosive nature of the testimony about to unfold. Media vans lined the streets for blocks in every direction, their satellite dishes reaching toward a gray October sky, like mechanical flowers seeking digital sunlight. Jake Morrison walked through the courthouse entrance with Ranger at his side, both of them wearing their dress uniforms, Jake in his Army service blues, Ranger in his official K9 working harness that bore Torres's name and unit designation. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. 2 soldiers reporting for duty, 1 final time. The gallery was packed with faces that represented the full spectrum of American military and political power. Senators, generals, defense contractors, and Gold Star families filled every available seat, their presence turning the courtroom into a microcosm of the nation's ongoing struggle between profit and principle. At the defense table sat David Castellanos and 3 other Blackwater executives, their expensive suits and confident demeanor projecting the kind of arrogance that comes from years of operating above the law. Behind them, a team of the country's most expensive defense attorneys prepared to argue that national security sometimes required uncomfortable compromises. But it was the prosecution table that drew Jake's attention. Deputy Director Martinez sat beside a team of federal prosecutors whose grim expressions suggested they understood the historical significance of what they were attempting. This wasn't just another criminal trial. It was a reckoning with the military-industrial complex itself. "Are you ready for this?" Martinez asked as Jake settled into the witness preparation room during a brief recess. Jake looked down at Ranger, who had positioned himself between Jake's chair and the door with the alert stillness of a soldier on guard duty. The dog's amber eyes swept the room constantly, cataloging potential threats with instincts honed by years of combat and loss. "We've been ready for 2 years," Jake replied, "ever since Torres died." The morning testimony established the foundation of the prosecution's case: dry recitations of weapons serial numbers, shipping manifests, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic theft and corruption. Jake watched the jury's faces as the evidence mounted, seeing confusion give way to comprehension, and then to horror as they realized the scope of the criminal enterprise. When his name was called, Jake stood and walked to the witness stand with Ranger at his side. The courtroom fell silent as they took their positions. Jake in the witness chair, Ranger sitting at attention beside him, both of them facing a room full of people who would determine whether Torres's sacrifice had any meaning. "State your name and occupation for the record," the lead prosecutor instructed. Master Sergeant Jacob Morrison, United States Army, retired. Currently serving as Witness Protection Specialist for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The prosecutor nodded and launched into questions that began with Jake's military background and gradually moved toward his deployment to Afghanistan. Jake answered each query with military precision, his voice steady and clear as he described the world in which he'd first encountered Captain Torres and Ranger. But it was when the questions turned to the weeks before Torres's death that the courtroom's atmosphere shifted from professional interest to electric tension. Sergeant Morrison, did Captain Torres ever express concerns about the weapons cache operations your unit was conducting? Jake's hand moved instinctively to touch Ranger's head, drawing strength from the contact before answering. Yes, sir. Captain Torres came to me approximately 3 weeks before his death. He was troubled by discrepancies he'd observed during cache inspections. What kind of discrepancies? American weapons in Taliban hands, not captured equipment. New weapons with fresh serial numbers that matched items that should have been in secure U.S. armories. A murmur ran through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. As he described Torres's growing suspicions and his determination to document evidence of weapons trafficking. Did Captain Torres ask you to assist with his investigation? Jake nodded. He needed help with secure communications. He was concerned that normal military channels had been compromised. The prosecutor introduced Torres's communications logs, displaying them on screens throughout the courtroom. Jake identified specific entries, explaining how Torres had used Jake's expertise to establish encrypted channels for reporting his findings to FBI contacts. But it was the defense attorney's cross-examination that brought the real drama. Sergeant Morrison, the lead defense counsel began, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to destroying witnesses. You've admitted to helping Captain Torres circumvent military chain of command. Isn't it true that you encouraged him to violate his oath of service? Jake felt Ranger tense beside him, the dog's protective instincts responding to the hostile tone, even though he couldn't understand the words. No, sir, Jake replied firmly. Captain Torres was trying to report criminal activity through appropriate channels. When those channels failed, he sought alternative means to ensure the information reached the proper authorities. Alternative means that violated security protocols and potentially compromised ongoing operations. Alternative means that exposed the murder of American soldiers for corporate profit, Jake shot back, his voice carrying across the courtroom like a rifle shot. The defense attorney smiled, recognizing an opportunity to portray Jake as an unstable veteran with an agenda. Sergeant Morrison, you've been treated for post-traumatic stress disorder, haven't you? You've experienced hallucinations, paranoid episodes, and violent outbursts. Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. Yes, sir. I've received treatment for PTSD related to my combat service. Isn't it possible that your mental health issues have colored your perception of these events? That what you remember as evidence of conspiracy was actually the confused memories of a traumatized veteran? The courtroom held its breath, waiting for Jake's response. This was the moment that could destroy the prosecution's case, the suggestion that their star witness was unreliable due to mental illness. That's when Ranger stood up, the massive German. Shepard rose to his feet with deliberate slowness, his movement drawing every eye in the courtroom. He padded forward until he stood directly in front of the defense attorney, amber eyes locked on the man's face with an intensity that made the lawyer take an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, the defense attorney stammered, the animal is... The animal, Judge Patricia Hawkins interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years presiding over complex cases, is a decorated military working dog whose service record includes 3 commendations for valor and 2 Purple Hearts. I think we can trust him to maintain courtroom decorum. Ranger held his position for another moment, then returned to Jake's side and resumed his seated position. But the message was clear to everyone present. This dog vouched for Jake Morrison's credibility with his life. Jake looked down at his 4-legged partner, feeling a surge of gratitude and love that threatened to overwhelm his composure. Then he turned back to the defense attorney and delivered the words that would define the rest of the trial. Sir, My PTSD comes from watching good soldiers die for bad reasons, from carrying the guilt of not preventing Captain Torres's murder, when I had the skills and opportunity to help him expose the corruption that killed him. Ranger and I both carry scars from Afghanistan, but those scars don't make us unreliable. They make us the only witnesses willing to tell the truth about what happened over there. The afternoon brought testimony that shattered the defense's carefully constructed narrative. Jake described Torres's final communications, the evidence the young captain had gathered, and the systematic cover-up that followed his death. He detailed the intimidation attempts, the false flag operations, and the manipulation of military personnel who genuinely believed they were protecting national security. But it was the introduction of Torres's personal effects that provided the trial's most devastating moment. "Sergeant Morrison, do you recognize this item?" the prosecutor asked, holding up a small digital camera that had been recovered from Torres's personal gear. Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "That's Captain Torres's backup camera. He used it to photograph evidence when his official equipment might have been monitored." The prosecutor activated a large screen and began displaying photographs that Torres had taken in the weeks before his death. Images of weapons caches, serial numbers, shipping containers, and documents that painted an irrefutable picture of systematic weapons trafficking. The final photograph stopped the trial cold. It showed Torres and Ranger during their last mission, together, taken by Jake using Torres's camera. The young captain was kneeling beside his partner, both of them covered in desert dust, but radiating the kind of contentment that comes from perfect partnership. Torres's face was relaxed and happy, his arm draped casually over Ranger's shoulders. In the background, barely visible in the photograph's edge, was the weapons cache that would explode 2 days later, killing Torres and nearly destroying all evidence of the criminal conspiracy he'd died to expose. "This photograph was taken 48 hours before Captain Torres's death," the prosecutor announced quietly. "It shows a young soldier who believed he was serving his country and protecting his fellow Americans. He died because he tried to stop people from selling weapons to the enemies who were killing his friends." Jake heard sniffling from the gallery, saw jurors wiping their eyes, felt his own vision blur with tears he'd been holding back for 2 years. Beside him, Ranger whined softly, not from distress, but from recognition. He remembered that day, remembered Torres's happiness, remembered the partnership that death had stolen from both of them. The defense had no response to that photograph, no argument that could explain away the evidence Torres had died to preserve. Their cross-examination became increasingly desperate, attacking tangential details, while avoiding the central truth that their clients had murdered 7 American soldiers to protect their profit margins. When Jake's testimony concluded, the courtroom erupted in applause that took 5 minutes for the judge to control. He and Ranger walked back to their seats through a gallery, filled with veterans, military families, and citizens who understood that they had witnessed something rare and precious, truth spoken in the face of overwhelming power. The trial's conclusion came 3 weeks later with verdicts that sent shockwaves through Washington and beyond. Guilty on all counts, conspiracy to commit murder, weapons trafficking, racketeering, treason. David Castellanos and his co-conspirators were sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Colonel Hayes, who had cooperated with investigators after her arrest, received a reduced sentence of 20 years. Dozens of other conspirators, from Pentagon officials to defense contractors, faced their own trials in the months that followed. But for Jake and Ranger, justice was measured in something more personal than prison sentences. As they left the courthouse for the final time, Jake paused on the steps and looked up at the American flag flying over the federal building. The same flag Torres had served, the same principles he had died defending, the same ideals that Jake and Ranger would continue to honor for the rest of their lives. "So he did it, boy," Jake whispered to Ranger. "We got them. Torres can rest now." Ranger's response was to lean against Jake's legs, a gesture of comfort and solidarity that spoke to bonds stronger than death, loyalty deeper than betrayal, and love. That could survive anything the world might throw at them. They were family, forged in the crucible of war, tested by corruption and violence, proven by their willingness to stand together when standing meant risking everything. Torres would have been proud. The small ranch house sat on 40 acres of Colorado grassland, surrounded by rolling hills that stretched to the horizon like a sea of golden wheat. It was the kind of place where silence had weight and meaning, where the only sounds were wind through tall grass and the distant call of hawks riding thermals toward mountains that scraped the belly of endless sky. Jake Morrison stood on his front porch in the early morning light, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, as he watched Ranger explore the perimeter of their property with the methodical precision of a soldier conducting reconnaissance. Even here, 2 years after the trial, old habits died hard. Some protective instincts would never fade completely. The media circus had finally moved on to other stories, other scandals, other battles between truth and power. The book deals and movie offers had been politely declined. Jake had no interest in profiting from Torres's memory or turning their story into entertainment for people who had never worn the uniform or understood the cost of service. Instead, he had used his witness protection compensation and veterans' benefits to buy this piece of land where he and Ranger could live quietly, healing in the way that only silence and space could provide. The nightmares had faded gradually, replaced by dreams of hiking trails and morning coffee, shared with the only family member who truly understood what they had survived together. The mailbox at the end of their gravel driveway bore both their names, Morrison and Ranger. It was a small acknowledgement of their partnership, but it meant everything to Jake. Ranger wasn't his pet or his therapy animal. Ranger was his brother in arms, his partner, his family. Inside the house, Torres's photographs covered one wall of Jake's study. Not formal military portraits, but candid shots that captured the young captain's personality. Torres laughing at something Ranger had done, Torres sharing an MRE with local children, Torres reading a letter from home while Ranger dozed beside him in the Afghan heat. It was a shrine to friendship and sacrifice, tended with the devotion of someone who understood that some bonds transcend death. The legal settlements from Blackwater Security and their co-conspirators had provided enough money to establish the Torres Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting military working dog programs and providing financial assistance to the families of soldiers killed in the line of duty. Jake served as the foundation's director, though most of the day-to-day work was handled by others. His job was simply to ensure that Torres's name remained associated with honor, integrity, and the kind of courage that chose death over compromise. Ranger padded up the porch steps and settled beside Jake's chair, his massive head resting on knee, his pause as he watched the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. At 8 years old, the German Shepherd was entering the twilight of his career, though his loyalty and intelligence remained as sharp as ever. Grey had begun to show around his muzzle, and his movements carried the subtle stiffness of a body that had endured too much combat and trauma. Jake reached down to scratch behind Ranger's ears, feeling the familiar comfort of contact with the creature who had saved his life in ways that went far beyond physical protection. Ranger had given him purpose when purpose seemed lost, hope when hope felt impossible, and love when love required risking everything they had left. "Morning, partner," Jake said quietly, their daily ritual beginning as it had every day for the past 2 years. Ranger's tail thumped once against the porch floor, acknowledgement rather than excitement, the measured response of a professional who understood that some moments required dignity rather than enthusiasm. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up around them. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding invisible. Currents toward hunting grounds in the distant valley. Somewhere in the tall grass, meadowlarks began their morning songs, liquid notes that carried across the landscape like musical prayers offered to the rising sun. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from Deputy Director Martinez, now retired, from the FBI, and working as a consultant on military corruption cases. Her messages came sporadically, usually containing updates on ongoing prosecutions or news about other veterans who had found the courage to speak truth to power. Today's message was different. Torres's parents would like to visit. They want to meet Ranger,